Imagine you drop a bomb on someone's house. The house burns down, the roof collapses, and you walk away thinking the fight is over. But then 3 days later, your neighbor's house explodes. Your ally's oil tanker sinks in the Gulf. A drone strikes a military base 600 miles away, and nobody claims responsibility. That is not a coincidence. That is Iran. Here is what nobody tells you about modern warfare in the Middle East. The goal was never to win. The goal was to make winning irrelevant. And Iran figured that out decades before anyone else thought to ask the question. It built an entire military doctrine around one single idea. If you cannot beat your enemies face to face, make the cost of fighting you so unbearable, so expensive, so endless that they eventually stop trying. Military analysts call it forward defense, but that phrase is far too clean for what it actually describes. What it really means is that Iran does not wait to be attacked inside its own borders. It plants pieces of itself all across the region, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and those pieces fight on its behalf before the war ever reaches Iranian soil. By the time a missile lands in Tehran, Iran has already been fighting your allies for 20 years. But this didn't start with drones or nuclear negotiations. It started with a humiliation. In 1953, a CIA-engineered coup overthrew Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a man who simply wanted Iran to control its own oil. The British had been extracting Iranian petroleum for decades and paying almost nothing in return. Mossadegh said enough. So London called Washington. Washington sent an operative named Kermit Roosevelt, yes, a grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, and within days, the elected government was gone. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was reinstalled on his throne, trembling and grateful and entirely owned by Western powers. That moment burned itself into the Iranian national memory like a brand on skin. Understand it, and you understand everything that came after. Every decision, every alliance, every missile pointed westward. For 25 years, Iran under the Shah was America's closest ally in the Middle East, armed to the teeth with American weapons and American training. But inside the country, resentment was quietly becoming rage. The Shah's secret police, Savak, tortured and disappeared thousands of political opponents, while the wealth from oil flowed upward to the elite and outward to foreign companies. Then, in 1979, the whole structure collapsed in weeks. The Islamic Revolution did not just change Iran's government, it rewired Iran's entire strategic identity. The country that had been America's watchdog in the Persian Gulf became its most determined adversary almost overnight. The new leaders, permanently scarred by what had happened in '53, made one foundational decision. Never again would Iran be vulnerable to a foreign power, pulling its strings from the outside, and never again would it fight a conventional war against an enemy it couldn't beat in the open field. They would build something that no bomb could ever fully destroy: a network. The Iran-Iraq War then taught them the hardest possible lesson about what conventional warfare actually costs. From 1980 to 1988, Saddam Hussein's forces, backed financially and militarily by the United States, France, and the Gulf monarchies, ground Iran down in a war of attrition that killed hundreds of thousands of people on both sides. Iran fought back with human wave attacks and revolutionary fervor that simply could not compensate for superior firepower and better equipment. When the ceasefire finally came, the borders were roughly the same as when the first shot was fired. All that death, and nothing moved. Iran looked at those 8 years of carnage and drew the only rational conclusion available. Fighting the conventional way is suicide against a better-equipped enemy backed by superpowers. So they stopped trying to fight that way, and they started building something else entirely. They invested in what military strategists call asymmetric warfare, the art of inflicting pain on a stronger enemy without ever meeting them on their terms. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, known as the IRGC, became the engine of this new doctrine. Not just a military force, but a political, economic, and intelligence apparatus with one overriding mission: project Iranian power outward quietly, cheaply, and with enough layers of separation that Tehran could always look at the camera and say it had nothing to do with anything. They found their first laboratory in Lebanon, In the early 1980s, a small group of Lebanese Shia fighters, funded and trained by the IRGC, coalesced into Hezbollah, the Party of God. Within a decade, Hezbollah had become the most sophisticated non-state armed organization in the world, capable of striking targets deep inside Israel with precision rockets, managing hospitals and schools for the Lebanese population, and running intelligence operations across 3 continents. It wasn't just an ally, it was Iran's permanent forward position sitting on Israel's northern border like a weapon that never needed to be drawn to do its job. Then Iran replicated the model everywhere it could. In Iraq, after the American invasion of 2003 hollowed out the state and left a power vacuum, Iranian-backed militias filled it before the dust had settled. In Syria, when Bashar al-Assad's government was weeks away from collapse, Iranian forces and Hezbollah fighters arrived and kept it alive at enormous cost. In Yemen, the Houthi movement, which had its own deep local grievances, received Iranian missiles, drones, and targeting technology, and transformed into a force capable of striking Riyadh and paralyzing commercial shipping in the Red Sea. In Gaza, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad received Iranian funding and rocket manufacturing knowledge. Draw a line on a map connecting all of these groups. What you get is what Iran calls the axis of resistance, a web of armed movements stretching from the Mediterranean coast of Lebanon all the way to the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply flows in tankers every single morning. 20% of the world's oil, one narrow passage. Iran does not need to occupy that strait. It just needs to be close enough to threaten it. Here is the part that nobody in Washington or Tel Aviv wants to say out loud. You can bomb Iran, and it has been bombed. You can hit its air bases, its missile production facilities, its nuclear infrastructure, and degrade its military capacity by 30 or 40% in a single campaign. Iran will absorb the blow, parade the damage in front of its own population as proof of foreign aggression, and use it to consolidate domestic support. And then, within days or weeks, something happens somewhere else. A military base in Iraq gets struck by rockets at 3 in the morning. A commercial vessel gets harassed in the Strait of Hormuz. Hezbollah fires a coordinated salvo across the Lebanese border. The Houthis launch a ballistic missile toward a city hundreds of miles away. The attack never ends. It just moves. This is the architecture that makes Iran impossible to finish off cleanly. Not because it is invincible, it is not, and not because its military cannot be degraded, it can, and it has been. But because Iran engineered its entire defense around the assumption that it would be hit, isolated, and sanctioned, and it planned accordingly. For every military scenario its adversaries designed, Iran designed a response that does not require Iranian soldiers dying on Iranian soil. It requires someone else's soldiers dying somewhere else, and then someone else after them. That is not the behavior of a desperate state. That is the coldest, most patient form of strategic deterrence that the modern world has produced. What you are watching unfold in the Middle East is not a war with a clear front line or a decisive battlefield. There is no territory to seize, no capital to occupy that makes the conflict end, because the conflict was never contained to one place. It lives in Beirut and Baghdad and Sana'a and the Red Sea and the hard drives of Gulf oil facilities. Iran turned an entire region into its battlefield, and it fights from the shadows of every corner of it. The question was never whether Iran could win a war against the United States or Israel in a head-to-head confrontation. The real question, the one that keeps generals and presidents staring at ceilings at 3 in the morning, is whether anyone can afford to keep fighting one long enough to find out what it actually costs.